Imagine a land so prosperous that a single province like Bengal was wealthier than the whole of England combined. In 1700, India was not just a country, but the vibrant heart of global trade, holding nearly a quarter of the world economy. It was a paradise of gold, silk and spices, where fine cotton fabrics and exquisite jewellery were exported to all continents. India's urban centres shone with refined craftsmanship and the bustle of trade activities, where streams of gold and silver constantly flowed into the subcontinent instead of out. However, a catastrophic long slide occurred. By the time India gained independence in 1947, its share of the global economy had been dragged down to an unimaginable level, below 4%. This horrific decline did not happen naturally, nor was it simply a consequence of war smoke. For 2 centuries, the British Empire operated one of the most sophisticated colonial extraction systems in history, turning a brilliant civilization into a massive profit-making machine for London. They transformed an empire that once exported luxury goods to Rome, Arabia and China into a source of cheap raw materials for British factories, and they did so through a silent revolution in financial recording and taxation. This is not a story of nationalism or hatred, but a story of cold numbers and facts. It tells of how one of the world's most prosperous societies became one of its poorest lands, not due to backwardness, but because of a financial design meticulously calculated to every detail. To fully understand this ruthless transformation, we must go back in time to the early 1600s, a period long before the British flag flew over the skies of Delhi. At that time, India was under the rule of the Mughal Empire, a vast and developed civilization with nearly 150 million people, accounting for nearly a quarter of the world's population at the time. Under the great shadow of the Mughal Empire, India emerged as a land of abundance and agricultural miracles. Endless fields were nourished by the most developed irrigation systems of the time, turning this place into the world's granary. At ports like Surat and Kolkata, the rhythm of life never rested. The sound of unloading goods and the haggling in every language created a symphony of prosperity. The allure of smooth cotton fabrics, pungent pepper, indigo and precious silk from India was so great that European merchants were willing to gamble their lives. They spent months drifting on the ocean, overcoming fierce storms and pirates just to touch the treasures of the East. At that time, India was like a giant magnet sucking in the wealth of humanity. By maintaining a trade surplus with almost every nation, gold and silver from all over the world constantly poured into the subcontinent, creating a treasury of assets accumulated over many centuries. However, on the other side of the ocean, a completely different entity was taking shape. On a small but ambitious island nation, the British were not only preparing military force but also equipping themselves with an unprecedented economic weapon, the Joint Stock Company model. In 1600, a royal charter was granted, giving birth to the British East India Company. This was not just a group of merchants, it was the rise of a business model combining profit and guns, a machine that began organising the economy in a way the Old World had never imagined. In 1600, a royal decree from Queen Elizabeth changed the flow of history forever by allowing the establishment of the British East India Company. Starting as just a group of London merchants seeking opportunity, this entity quickly mutated into a fearsome power beyond all conventional definitions. It was not a government, yet it operated like a miniature state with shareholders, a board of directors, and soon its own battle-hardened army. In a market full of competition, where the Portuguese, Dutch and French had already taken root, the East India Company was initially just a small latecomer. However, while other nations sought cooperation and coexistence, the British nurtured a more extreme ambition: absolute monopoly. They did not want to share a slice of the trade pie. They wanted to own the entire oven. Their secret weapon to suffocate rivals was not clever diplomacy or modern firearms, but the terrifying power of finance. Backed by a formidable credit network in London, raising capital through bonds and secured by insurance from Lloyd's, the company possessed the ability to expand the scale of trade at a speed unprecedented in history. They fought with balance sheets as fiercely as with bayonets on the battlefield. The real turning point occurred when company leaders realised a grim truth: profit from trading goods was insignificant compared to the power of tax collection. In 1757, The Battle of Plassey, a seemingly small clash in the Bengal region, became the hinge that turned world history. This was the moment when merchants officially cast off their trade robes to become rulers. With fewer than 1,000 British soldiers and the support of a small group of local allies, the East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal. But the most glorious feat did not lie in the enemy's corpses on the battlefield, but in the political consequence immediately following. By setting up a puppet king and granting themselves Diwani rights, the right to collect all taxes from the prosperous Bengal region, this company gave birth to an unprecedented corporate colonial model, where shareholder profits were built on the taxes of the people. That historical decision officially birthed an entity without precedent, the corporate colonial model. From that moment on, the East India Company was no longer merely traders of goods, but had transformed into a giant financial blood-sucking machine. In just a short decade, tens of millions of pounds were steadily drained from the Bengal region every year. The systemically drained wealth was so vast that it created a horrific shock. Runaway inflation, total financial collapse, and famines that reached the heavens spread across the region. A ruthless paradox appeared on the world map. While London was brilliant and flourishing thanks to the inflow of money, Kolkata was sunk in depletion, hunger, and death. In London, the British Parliament was completely overwhelmed by the unimaginable profit figures. Company dividends soared, stock prices boomed, making distant investors, those who had never set foot in Asia, supremely wealthy. But behind the dancing numbers on the balance sheets in England lay a bloody truth. Those taxes were wrung from poor Indian peasants themselves, people who did not even have enough money to feed their families through the day. At this time, the East India Company had mutated into something the world had never seen, a monopoly private empire. It not only held economic power, but also possessed its own currency, its own court system, and a separate army, ready to crush anyone standing in the way of shareholder profits. In London, the company leaders sat leisurely in luxurious meeting rooms, surrounded by precious wood and candlelight, discussing growth figures on balance sheets. But on the other side of the globe, the reality was a nightmare. Their representatives were directly supervising forced labour systems, tightening trade monopolies, and stifling all local craft industries. All these ruthless actions were subtly disguised under a glamorous name, free market. This was not merely a spontaneous looting, but a systemic and coldest transfer of assets in history. The peak of this cruelty was the horrific famine in Bengal in 1770, a disaster that claimed the lives of about 10 million people. While bodies lay scattered along the roads, amidst the heart-wrenching cries of a depleted land, a ghastly paradox still occurred. The company's revenue continued to grow. Disregarding the surrounding death, the colonial machine still operated without missing a beat. They still collected taxes regularly and still exported grain out of the starving land. For investors in London, it was not a humanitarian disaster, but a favourable business year with massive profits. In the gears of colonial capitalism at that time, the concept of the market had completely crushed and replaced the concept of compassion. Meanwhile, to soothe consciences and polish their image, British economists back home created a perfect moral mask, the civilizing mission. They touted that India was a backward land, and Britain was generously modernizing this country through building railways, enacting laws, and popularizing English education. But behind those slogans of progress, they were actually only new tools to control and extract resources more effectively than ever. What was touted by the British Empire as reforms were actually just gears in a giant extraction machine. Look at the railway system, something often praised as a symbol of modernization. In reality, those steel rails were not laid down to connect Indian people or culture. They were designed as a giant conveyor belt connecting directly from rich cotton fields to export ports, moving resources out of the subcontinent as quickly as possible. Similarly, the education system was not built to liberate thinking or create a prosperous middle class. It was only a foundry to train diligent clerks to serve the bloated colonial administrative machine. Even the courts were not a place to protect justice for the people, but became a legal tool to tighten the spiral of debt, turning indigenous people into perpetual debtors on their own land. The greatest cruelty lay in the financial nature of these works. British investors were guaranteed a 5% profit per year, a figure paid directly from the tax money of the Indian people. Regardless of whether the railways operated effectively or at a loss, profits still steadily flowed to the vaults in London, while all costs and risks were dumped onto the shoulders of the people of Calcutta. This was indeed a vampire finance system. It drained the strength of a nation without leaving any trace of sharing. This extraction mechanism operated so sophisticatedly that it was given its own haunting name by scholars, the drain of wealth. In 1901, the brilliant scholar Dadabhai Naoroji exposed this truth in his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. He described this phenomenon with a painful image. India is bleeding. The resources, labour and capital of the subcontinent incessantly flowed to Britain like a one-way waterfall, never to return. According to Naoroji's estimates, by the end of the 19th century, India lost hundreds of millions of pounds every year. That enormous amount of money was the blood that nourished the brilliant Industrial Revolution and the expansionist wars of the British Empire across the globe. His analyses were not mere words, they were ruthless truths proven by history. In the period from 1765 to 1938, historians have put forward a figure that shocked the whole world. The amount of wealth Britain extracted from India is estimated at the equivalent of $45 trillion in modern value. To put it simply, this massive amount of money is even larger than the total GDP of both the United States and China, the two strongest economies on the planet today combined. Those calculations are not just dry data. They are evidence of an irreparable loss, a profound pain weighing on the fates of hundreds of millions of people. For many centuries prior, India had always been a magnet for trade flows, exporting the most luxurious goods and importing precious metals from all over the world. However, under British rule, this situation was ruthlessly reversed. India was forced to change its role, from a sophisticated production centre to becoming a supplier of raw cotton, opium, and cheap grain, while being forced to open its market to consume finished goods from the very factories of Britain. The consequence of this policy was a silent economic massacre. Artisans, weavers, and merchants, who were once the pillars of the global luxury economy, were wiped out just by harsh colonial regulations. Industrial textiles from British factories flooded the Indian market at dirt-cheap prices, leaving local artisans, those who created products with all their heart and manual skill, no way to compete. Cities once brilliant and famous for the weaving craft like Dhaka gradually fell into a state of collapse and ruin. By the mid-19th century, a heartbreaking paradox had been completed. India, from a position as the world leader in textiles, had been turned into a giant cotton field, solely to serve the machines in Manchester. That was the true face of what was called globalization 19th century style, a system perfectly designed to drain resources from the colony and build up the prosperity of the metropole. India, from an autonomous production centre, was turned into a massive raw material supplier for Britain's industrial wheel, while simultaneously becoming a suffocatingly controlled consumer market. While British officials always proudly touted the Modernization mission, a grim reality remained. India's per capita income almost did not move for nearly 2 centuries. Paradoxically, as famines occurred with greater frequency and the labour wages of indigenous people plummeted, the British Empire grew ever larger and wealthier. This was completely not a coincidence of history, but a meticulously calculated business model. While every empire before it collected tribute with swords and spears, the British elevated it to an art, making tribute look like normal free trade activities. History records many invasions, but rarely is there a place where the colonised became the most loyal sponsor for the very ones who invaded them. Moving into the 19th century, after the rebellion of 1857, the East India Company faded into the shadows to make room for direct rule by the British Crown. Though the face of power changed, the exploitative financial machinery remained intact. At this time, the British Empire realised they did not need to conquer further with military force or gunpowder smoke, for they held in their hands a supreme and quieter power, binding contracts. The sophistication reached its peak when revenue from the sweat and tears of the Indian people was used to pay for Britain's expeditions as far away as Afghanistan, to pay pensions for officials in London, and even to nurture the colonial administrative machine in Africa. The entire operating cost of that massive empire was skillfully transferred onto the shoulders of the colonised. For Britain, this was indeed the best deal in centuries, a system where the victim was not only exploited, but also had to pay for the very chains that bound them. By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire had elevated exploitation into a sophisticated art, financial imperialism. No longer needing noisy military campaigns, they disguised the extraction under the cloak of professional administrative management to the point that it looked like a normal public service activity. The British government in India perfected a mechanism with a name that sounded harmless but was powerful: home charges. In fact, this was a forced invoice that India was forced to pay annually for services they had no right to refuse. This list included everything, from salaries for British officials ruling right on Indian soil, interest for loans London provided to build infrastructure, which originally served Britain's extraction goals, to pensions for retired officials who had returned home, and even the cost of maintaining the British army stationed on the subcontinent. On theory, they were labelled as valid administrative costs, but in reality it was a subtle accounting trick to drain assets without costing a single bullet. Each year, massive streams of money were sucked back to London without any actual value of goods or services flowing back to compensate local people. This was a ruthless one-way financial flow, a colonial balance sheet whose only task was to push all surplus value to the brilliant north and leave poverty behind. By the early 20th century, these money transfers alone had exceeded $100 million per year, a figure equivalent to tens of billions of dollars according to modern purchasing power. Looking back at the overall picture after 2 centuries, economists have put forward a figure that would shock anyone. The amount of wealth extracted from India was equivalent to $45 trillion in modern value. This figure is so massive it is hard to believe, far exceeding the total GDP of both the United States and China combined at the present time. Though time has passed, the traces of this major financial surgery still exist deeply in the structure of the global economy today. Let me know where you're watching this story from by leaving a comment below the video. And if you find this story interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel and follow upcoming videos. The once brilliant economy based on India's talented artisan class and dynamic merchant class was completely wiped out, replaced by an exhausted peasant society deeply in debt. Meanwhile, the prosperity of British industrial centres like Manchester, Birmingham or Liverpool was built directly from the massive profit streams taken from the raw materials of the subcontinent. The textile mills in Lancaster could glow with lights all night, precisely because the manual looms in India had been forced to be silent forever. In the eyes of the British Parliament, this transition was praised as a step forward for the era. But the reality for India was a ruthless and systemic process of de-industrialization. However, textiles were not the only sector to suffer this devastating storm. Other long-standing traditional industries such as shipbuilding, iron smelting and carpentry also declined under the pressure of harsh colonial policies. Natural resources were exploited to an extreme degree, as India's vast forests were cut down mercilessly just to take wood for railway sleepers to serve the goal of exploitation. Even more sadly, farmers were forced to abandon food cultivation to switch to growing export crops like indigo and opium, serving Britain's trade machine instead of ensuring the right to be well fed for their own nation. When droughts arrived, the consequences were not just a bad harvest, but a ruthless humanitarian tragedy unprecedented in scale. From 1876 to 1902, waves of famine spread across the subcontinent, claiming the lives of more than 20 million people. Yet, a heartbreaking paradox still occurred. Even in the darkest years, millions of tons of grain were steadily leaving Indian ports to be carried to Britain. The amount of food that could have saved countless souls was taken abroad, only because export revenue was placed higher than human life. Even more outrageous, a British official named Sir Richard Temple even vehemently opposed relief, arguing that such a humanitarian act would break the market laws. At that time, the market had become the only measure of morality. But perhaps the most sophisticated and terrifying part of this system lay in how it used India's own financial blood to feed the entire empire. When Britain conducted expeditions in Afghanistan, Burma or Africa, most of those enormous costs were paid by the Indian government's own revenue. India was not just a mere colony, but actually had become the central bank of the entire British Empire. Indian soldiers had to fight on every front from Sudan to Singapore, but their wages were deducted from the very taxes of the poor people at home. Even many British infrastructure works across the world were built from the accumulated capital of the Indians themselves. The entire giant empire operated smoothly thanks to the rupee. Even when Indian villages were depleted to the point where people were barely surviving the day due to a lack of cash, investors in London still leisurely enjoyed guaranteed profits from infrastructure projects that Indians themselves were bearing the costs for. The railway system is often praised as the greatest gift Britain bestowed upon India, but behind those steel rails is a ruthless financial Trojan Horse. In reality, these works were built using capital from Britain, through contracts guaranteeing a 5% annual profit for investors, a figure drawn directly from the tax money of the Indian people. Bitterly, if the railways operated inefficiently and did not create enough profit as committed, the poor Indian people themselves had to be the ones to make up for that shortfall to ensure the pockets of the London financiers. In this unjust economic model, all risks were pushed toward the Indian people, while the rewards and lucrative profits naturally belonged to the British. This is the core essence of the colonial financial model, where profits are privatised for Western shareholders, while costs and losses are pushed toward the whole of Indian society to bear. Even when the East India Company was dissolved, this exploitative mindset did not disappear, but evolved into a more sophisticated form. The financial circles in London quickly realised a new truth. They did not need to bother occupying territory or maintaining expensive armies to profit. They only needed to control the capital flow and credit system to hold the fate of an entire nation. The British Empire found its final, sustainable, and hardest to recognise form of rule: debt. When independence was won in 1947, India not only inherited a legacy of extreme poverty, but was also tied tightly in a system of financial dependence lasting many generations. Independence Day had come, but the chains of contracts and debt figures remained, forcing this nation to enter a new arduous struggle to regain true economic sovereignty from the ruins of colonialism. Centuries of being drained left a devastated India. Local industries decayed, domestic capital was completely destroyed, and the literacy rate of an entire nation was dragged down to below 2%. Along with that was the obsession with periodic famines that had eaten deep into the national psyche. However, the moment of gaining independence in 1947 did not bring full freedom as expected. The world India entered at that time still operated under a globalised financial system built on the very principles that the British Empire once applied: trade imbalance, one-way capital flows, and invisible wealth extractions. Newly independent but economically fledgling nations quickly fell into a familiar pre-laid trap. They were forced to continue exporting raw materials at low prices, importing expensive finished goods, and had to borrow money in foreign currencies to maintain their machinery. This structure sounds familiar, because it is the 20th century version of the mechanism that once drained India for 200 years prior. Today, that exploitation no longer carries the colonial name, but is called by polished professional terms debt dependency or structural adjustment. Wealth still silently flows from poor nations to the wealthiest economies, but now it has been disguised under the name of policy. Organisations like the IMF or the World Bank no longer need guns or soldiers to command troops. Instead, they use the power of loans with conditions, harsh austerity programs, and unequal trade rules to create results similar to the era of colonial armies. The empire may have collapsed geographically, but the financial spreadsheets are still operating as ruthlessly and effectively as before. Today, the flow of wealth still diligently flows from the poor to the rich, but it is no longer as blatant as before, but skillfully disguised under the cloak of policies. Each year, developing countries must transfer back to wealthier economies more than $200 billion in interest and reinvested profits. This figure coldly far exceeds the total amount of aid they receive, creating an inescapable financial trap. The flow of this exploitation has never reversed. It has simply become more digitized to fit the times. The old empires may have collapsed on the geopolitical map, but the financial spreadsheets still operate precisely according to the colonial era's design. This is the silent truth of global capitalism, a system built based on the very primal extraction principles of empire. This logic of extraction still exists, only it has become more sophisticated, quieter, and harder to recognize. If in the past Britain industrialized by wringing resources and labor from India, today modern nations do the same in new ways. They still rely on cheap outsourced labour, massive foreign debts, and profits laundered through offshore financial centres. Times may change, but the imbalance still stands there like a reminder of the past. empires do not disappear. They are simply evolving. They shift from seizing land to controlling ledgers, from the power of gunpowder to the binding of contracts, and from invading with armies to surrounding with strict regulations. And the story of India, from a gem being drained to a rising power, is the clearest testament to this ruthless transformation of history. What the British colonizers built in India was not merely a ruling regime, but actually the first prototype of the modern global economy. Here, value is no longer looted crudely with swords and spears, but is shifted silently and sophisticatedly through the credit network, trade rules, and a strict tax system. The Raj was once promoted as the world's largest experiment in the free market, but it was a deceptive freedom, where the door only opened wide for the invader. Even today, when praising globalization, we often unintentionally forget that its origin was a network established to drain resources from distant lands back to the imperial center. As time passed, the ships that once carried silk and spices transformed into digitized financial capital flows crossing borders. The banks once established to serve imperial ambitions have now donned a new cloak as development support programs. Though the tools have changed, the profit stream still often flows in the same old direction as hundreds of years ago. Yet, in the whirlwind of that extraction, India stood firm, and this is perhaps the most unexpected, most inspiring twist of this entire historical story. Despite suffering systemic looting, horrific famines that took millions of lives, and deep division lasting more than 2 centuries, this nation still resiliently stood up from the ruins of colonialism. Instead of sinking into hatred, India chose the path of self-reliance through innovation. Today, India is one of the world's fastest-growing economies. This rise does not only lie in dry growth figures, but is also a spectacular exchange of position on the global power map. If in the past the British Empire turned this entire subcontinent into a source of cheap materials for British factories, today's India has built its own empire of brainpower and digital technology. The textile looms, once strangled by colonial policy, have now been replaced by streams of code operating the financial and technological systems of all humanity. In Silicon Valleys like Bengaluru or Hyderabad, a new class of intellectual experts is redefining India's value, turning this country into the world's largest ET service centre, possessing a type of asset that no colonial accounting system can drain. Another powerful proof of this fierce recovery is India's great step into space. Remember that in 1947, when the British left, they left behind an exhausted nation with a share of the world economy dragged down from nearly a quarter to below 4%. But from those ruins, India has risen to become the first country to successfully land a probe on the south pole of the moon. The images of crude vehicles carrying rocket components in the early days of the space agency ISRO have been replaced by majestic launch pads, sending satellites of developed nations into orbit. This is not just a scientific achievement, but a steel-like message about reclaiming sovereignty over the future. From a colony once thoroughly exploited to nurture the industrial revolution of the West, India is now leading the latest technological revolutions itself. The transformation from an economy dependent on agricultural and raw material exports to a high-tech and innovative power is the clearest answer to centuries of being drained of assets. Though old wounds still exist in the social structure, India's position on the international stage is no longer as a jewel in the crown of anyone else, but an independent entity directly shaping the new world economic order. But historical wounds still exist. The gap between rich and poor, between the global north and south to this day still reflects the lines of division from hundreds of years ago. Old trade routes have transformed into capital flows, posing a question that every generation must face. When a system values extraction over value creation, can it truly be free? Because in the end, what the British Empire demonstrated was not that empires fall, but that they know how to adapt. And what India proved is that even the most severely exploited nations can rise again. It is simply that the recovery process takes time. Extraction happens instantly, and that is the ruthless mathematics of every empire. The British did not just conquer India with an army, they conquered with bookkeepers. The ledger they opened in 1757 to this day has not yet been closed. It only differs in that it carries new names and is operated with more modern tools. History does not repeat itself, but balance sheets always carry a familiar resonance. If this video brings you a new perspective, don't forget to press the like and subscribe buttons for the History Toons channel to not miss upcoming content. Your support is truly the motivation for me to continue making many more quality videos. Thank you very much.